In the world of special needs, we all need each other. And that's something that every single person has to keep in mind because we either are in the 33% of American families that have special needs people, or I'm going to use a statistic from our guest, Yvette Pegues, who I'll introduce a little more fully in a second. Her stat was 1 in 4 Americans have disabilities. So there is so much to cover in this world. And thus far, even though the show is new, thus far my interviews have only been on neurological disabilities. But this is now a different one. We have both neurological and we have physical/functional disabilities. And that's where Yvette comes in. And maybe a little of both here. You're going to clarify that. So, our guest today is Yvette Pegues. Yvette, thank you, first of all, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, this is going to be great. I so enjoyed meeting you last week and couldn't wait to get to this interview. So, Yvette has a very interesting backstory. So, Yvette is brilliant, Harvard bound, engineer, and then her world changed. And this is where you can give us your story better than anybody, Yvette, please.
Thank you for the opportunity. And thank you for all that you do to make this a conversation that must be had. When you talk about 25 to 33% of individuals with disabilities and technology and medical advances allowing us to live longer, this becomes an even greater issue. It's something I found out about less than 10 years ago after, as you mentioned, being accepted to Harvard, having two small pumpkins in my care, being married, and living a life where I had 7 figures and we went to owing 7 figures. So from making it to owing it after finding out that I was born with a brain malformation, I was not living as a person with a disability until after brain surgery was suggested by a neurologist in the emergency room who brought to my attention for the first time that I was born with a brain malformation and my brain had literally fallen into my spinal column. And as a precautionary measure, I needed to have brain surgery. So, in the process of brain surgery, complications impacted my spinal cord. So, I went from skipping all over the world with IBM about 90% of the time on planes, trains, and automobiles to being unable to walk, talk, or work for 2 years.
I didn't know you couldn't speak.
No, yeah, I literally had no voice. And through, speech therapy, physical therapy, and occupational therapy, I was able to recover to a place where I am today, but my IQ did drop into the double digits. So I was diagnosed as having a developmental and intellectual disability, as well as a physical traumatic brain and spinal cord injury, and now being a full-time wheelchair user.
Okay. Anybody looking at you and listening to you right now in this little square, this little rectangle of our screen, would not think anything other than this is a highly intelligent woman.
So my husband helped to kind of draw a picture for me. So, I have to imagine that everyone knows you would not be accepted or recruited into Harvard unless you had, something to offer, right? And so my husband said to me, well, your level of intellect was here. And so even though it dropped here, it's still not normal, right? So I can feel the difference. Neurologically, the difference is detectable. But because my husband says I am still operating at a level that is acceptable to the human interaction. So, believe it or not, because I could put a period at the end of a sentence, so many people say, well, you can't possibly have an intellectual or developmental disability. But medically, the way in which disability is measured, it's a decline, and the decline was significant. And it's clearly not the part of my brain that talks. It's the part of my brain that thinks and function and the cognitive part of my brain that processes information that had not been a problem before. So we're looking at the whole brain, not just the part of the brain that is present in this interview.
Do you think, and tell me if you don't want to go here with my next question, do you think if you had never had the operation, nothing would have come up in your life? Do you think that was the catalyst, or would there may have been another catalyst?
Hmm. Would I be here? Absolutely not. Uh, had I not had the pain on my right side that led me to the emergency
Mm.
room, I'd probably be in the bushes at on a Harvard campus somewhere, and they would have found me incapacitated. And so I do feel like even though this disability was the worst thing that happened to me and my family, it's also the best thing that happened to others because I can roll into a room with the experience of walking and not walking, having children and being told that I probably should have died during childbirth because of the inflammation that would trigger some of the condition that I am experiencing today. It also answered a whole bunch of questions for me, a lot of things that I couldn't really put my finger on now makes sense. And it's generational. It actually reconnected me to my mom since Arnold Chiari malformation is usually passed down from a mother to a girl child. So I don't believe my mother knew she had it. Imaging wasn't as popular maybe 20, 25 years ago. So the only way to really find this condition is through imaging of the brain, very specific imaging. And I was fortunate enough to have a neurologist in the emergency room after hours of trying to figure out what's wrong to look for it. And so I did the history. I guess about 20, 30 years ago, it was originally recognized in 1902. It was called the crazy woman syndrome, where we would hold the back of our heads and we would talk about the pressure and we talk about the pain, but it just really couldn't be categorized. And they just figured, well, she's a crazy woman. I can't find anything. Something else must be wrong. Or maybe it's her hormones or all the other attacks on women when we're in pain.
So much there I want to ask questions about. This is such an education. Number one, I am more conversant with autism than what your diagnosis. What I learned with autism and what I learned from a friend of mine who at 22 or 23 turned blind.
Yeah.
Fully functional, athletic woman, started losing her peripheral vision, became blind. So with autism, I learned around three-ish, the changes occur, the brain in whatever stage it needs to be developed at isn't. And so there's regression.
Mhm.
There are other disabilities, neurological, that you can see at birth. So the interesting thing to me is those things that you don't see at birth and that were not caused by some outside force like an accident. So you were having pain, which forced you to go to the emergency room, but enough more than what you had been experiencing was which was head discomfort. Is that correct?
That is perfectly described. So there's head aches and then there's head pain. So I thought I was having migraines, which is very similar, but the head pain caused the migraine. And so the head pain came from the condition itself. And if you think of a brain and the tonsils at the end of your brain, at the back of your head that fall just below your C1, C2 in your spinal cord was too long. And so, because of that malformation over time, it covered access for the fluid in your brain that passes through your entire body to do what it's meant to do. So then it's trapped in your head. And the pressure that is caused from that is where the headaches came from. That's where kind of the depth perception, the loss of that,
Mhm.
the balance, and all the things in the back of my head that told me I was a little bit quirky, but I was also an engineer. So quirks are cool, right? And so that is what I'm learning now is the problem. And ironically, because it's neurological, it definitely is a cousin of autism. After my injury, I had so many of the very same behavioral, touch point, and social issues that most people, talk about
With autism.
with autism and being
Yeah.
on the spectrum, because it is a spectrum, right? And when I learned about it, it's like, well, you could be high functioning, you could be nonverbal. So somewhere on that spectrum, in fact, there's even a neurologist who met me and said, you may want to test because neurologically you could have shifted in categorically into that space.
You said one other thing that I have heard before, and that is that it's generational. So I learned this from women who run an organization called Impact Parents. And it's for parents of ADHD and ADD children who need help just functioning as parents.
Yes,
And in talking to them, I learned that it is generational. So these women got themselves tested
yes,
and they had ADHD,
yes,
which answered other questions about their little quirks, their little idiosyncrasies that they didn't understand.
right.
So with your mom, is your mom still living?
She is not.
When this happened to you, was your mother living?
She was not.
Okay. Do you remember back your mother telling you she had aches and pains or any similar symptoms that you were having?
I love your line of questioning. Very few people connect what you're connecting. I will say, as you know, and for your audience, I am first generation American, high school and college. Neither one of my parents could read or write. So, coming from other countries, they were
Oh,
undereducated, not illiterate. They taught me five languages. So, as we recategorize the way that we are identified, I want to tell you that it wasn't talked about. Health was not a conversation, pain was not a conversation, it was a lifestyle. And so, posthumously, I feel like I got to know her better. I got to now identify possibly, victim or villain behavior to now victor behavior. How did you even, as opposed
survive.
to why did you,
Yeah.
So she did not know. And I think even in her death, the doctors were not sure. They say she died of an aneurysm that happens in the brain.
Isn't that interesting, Yvette?
It was Arnold Chiari malformation.
Oh my gosh.
I'm positive.
Oh my heavens. And do you remember her having pain or did she suffer in silence, do you
A
think?
little bit of both. What
Yeah.
I remember is how she reacted to Bane. I remember her behavior shifting quickly, and as children taking it personally. I remember her behaving in a way that could not be explained. And the three things she didn't have as a single mom was a husband, a diagnosis, and Jesus. Those are three things I had so that I could tap out. I could say to my husband, I am in so much pain right now. I can't even pick up our babies. Can you get the boys? I remember being able to fall to my knees and say, God, what is this? Give me peace. Give me solace. Give me something bigger than myself to hold on to in this moment. I had a diagnosis with very clear indicators that helped me understand the medication that I needed. So I had those things available to me. She had none. Her and my dad got divorced at 11. And part of their separation had to do with her, her shifts, in her behavior.
Oh,
So they
oh
didn't even
my.
know that what they were dealing with had nothing to do with their compatibility, but her inability to function in a space that was medically impossible without medication, a diagnosis, a partner, something bigger than herself to hold on to in those incredibly horrible moments. I remember very quickly that when the boys were born, we live here in Atlanta where everything is three stories. And I had to move the boys down to the main floor because going up and down the stairs were difficult. And we adapt. We're women. We adjust. I think early on in my career, I called myself and others, called me the adaptability expert. We adapt every single day, not just women, we all do, but in different ways. And so we just adapted. And I learned that, from my mom, and I'm sure she learned it from her mom.
That's so fascinating because my mom's not living either. She only died a few years ago.
So sorry.
Thank you. And two things. One of the things I came away from that death with was I have license now to only remember the good times. All the things that cause friction in relationships. I mean, mother-daughter relationships are really tough, aren't they? Some are great and some you just have to work through. Mine, I had to work through, but I loved my mother. And I didn't understand some of her behaviors. It was simply menopause. We know so little about so much going on in our lives. And here we are in 2025, and we're learning simple little things. So as I'm blocking, I'm like, why do I even have to think about the things that caused friction? That's not in my life anymore because she's not here. I now am flooded by the good memories. But one of the things that I kept focusing on was there are incidences that nobody understood. And I kind of think there was a little autism there or something else going on other than even the menopause. But I just think back and I'm like, how equipped are we really to be able to understand one another, therefore not be non-judgmental, therefore hang in there? Or if we're not capable of hanging in there because not everybody is, and I want to go to this point next, what do we do? I
Right.
mean, is it okay to leave and just say, listen, I just can't be the person you need me to be. I'm so sorry. Your husband hung in there, sorry.
He's still hanging.
He's still hanging. And how old were the boys when this happened, the operation?
I 8, 10. They were little bitty because I know, as you likely know, they published their book shortly thereafter.
Well,
So,
I'm gonna get to this in a second.
yeah, they
Yes.
were pretty little. And I think I told you my turning point was my older 7 or 8 year old when, he came home with a note from his teacher asking him to ask one of us how to respond to the question, is my mommy going to die? And I assume he was asking his teacher. And his teacher's like, I don't know how to answer this question. Give this to your mom, give this to your dad. And in that moment, I was still in recovery, but it wasn't hard to be mommy in that moment. It wasn't hard to say, you know what, God, you can break me, but please don't break my babies. And in that moment, because I couldn't walk or talk or work, I had to sit up, get out of bed, and make sure, if nothing else, the image of health was presented to these little nuggets. And so I literally tied myself upright in a chair so that I had the presence of mind to connect with my children, that I wasn't on all the medication that kept me in a fog. And in that moment, I said, they will never see me horizontal for months at a time without the ability to do so much again. And since then, as you know, I've been involved in 101 different things at once. So I'm way on the other side of that pendulum swing. But yeah, I'm involved in 21 different adaptive sports and working with profits and nonprofits and traveling the world again. And that all started because I wanted my kids to be okay.
Wow. Yes. So when I was perusing the website to get the larger view of everything that you were doing, because we just couldn't cover everything when we initially talked. So I came upon this support groups, the autistic support groups. There are other support groups that you had featured as resources on your website. And the website that I'm looking at was yourinvisibledisabilitygroup.com. That's the web, and that'll be in the show notes, everybody. But is that the primary website for this discussion?
I think it is. It's the organization that we created and literally backed into. We had no idea that it would be then what it is today. I just wanted to help newly disabled and diagnosed persons to have a bridge, right? To be the ladder for folks to climb after they've experienced a life-changing event. We just wanted to empower and equip and include people with disabilities because I didn't feel empowered or equipped or included. And so my husband had to say, okay, you've had a brain and a spinal cord injury, but if you're going to be a true advocate, you need to be deep and wide. Such an IBM term. But basically, know everything you need to know about your own condition and just enough about all of the other conditions to bring them to a place of peace, right? To bring them to a place of resource. So we became the bridge. We said, hey, I had to figure out how to reconnect to society, the world, and work. And as I do that, I'm going to collect those names so that the 80/20, and we call 80/20, going into this world of disability, picking up the phone and hearing no 80% of the time.
Isn't that the truth?
How depressing is that? So I
Yeah.
want to flip that through our experience. So when you pick up the phone, you know enough about your condition and the people who can support you to have an 80% success rate. And that's through our successes and all of the organizations that I started working with, connecting with, volunteering for. And that's where that resource page comes from and continues to grow because there are resources out there, but there are so many and they're so specific. As you mentioned, if you have a traumatic brain injury, an acquired brain injury, or a brain injury that came from jumping into an empty river, pool, or if you had your brain injury through a car accident, there is no one way in and out of some of those resources. So as an organization, we do an intake, we understand as much about you as we can, and we point you in the direction so that you can have an 80% success rate. And we've been doing it ever since, but the organization has changed. And the reason why it's your invisible disability group is because I have multiple disabilities. Some of them you can't see in my brain that affects my cognition. And of course, since I'm a wheelchair user full time, you can see. And we need to look at the whole person and give them grace and to recognize that we're all going through something. We just came out of something or we're on our way to something. So, just human empathy and grace is a way to not have to kick yourself after you figured out, oh, I didn't realize that person just lost someone, or that person is dealing with a disability that I can see, but they can't. You know, whatever that is, we're all in a position to receive grace.
I'm not going to forget about the book because I want to talk about it, but I don't want to lose this thought either. And that is, I really did want to ask you about communication because communication is so extremely important with everybody. I mean, you don't have a relationship if you can't communicate. Obviously, we think of verbal communication as the first line of communication. I mean, that's the easiest. That's how most of us who can't speak connect. But there are other ways that you have to communicate. And so I forget what we were talking about last week when we introduced ourselves, but there's a word, independability. Okay, that's you did your TED talk on that, or you have another one coming up. But that word, does that have to do with how to communicate and connect independability?
Yes. And thank you for mentioning that. Independability is more of the behavioral language and mode of communication that we must also be very aware of because they say what 80% of what we don't say happens in our bodies and our
Nonverbal. Yeah,
smiles and
nonverbal.
other nonverbal measures. But independability for me was about the ability to understand the interdependence that we have, not the independence. So for the first 2 years of my recovery, I was told that the goal was to be independent. And I get that, but it doesn't exist, right?
Correct. Yep.
We need each other. But you know what else we need? We need to understand that there's a lot of things we don't understand. So, as someone in a wheelchair, here's an example, approaching a building and the door is not powered and someone feels the need to open the door for me, the independability in that moment is, may I get the door for you, as opposed to assuming I can't get it for myself. It's being able to
Oh,
interact across all abilities. There's that, I have the ability to do some things you don't, and you have the ability to do some things I don't. But together, we can conquer the world together. So, independability is basically the interdependence on each other to be able to live in this world together.
I love that. I love that. That requires two things immediately, and that is empathy and not judgmentalness.
And communication, as you mentioned, right?
Yeah.
And being able to interact with each other and not be afraid of who we are or who we present ourselves as. And, I work at the local airport, the Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, on the ADA board for the entire airport, but I'm also a volunteer. The whole reason for bringing me in at its inception was because of my connection to my community, my impact and my love for my community. But at the same time, the airport has its own community. So instead of bringing information to the airport from my neighborhood, I treated the airport as a neighborhood. And so I said, I don't want to sit in an office on the fourth floor. I want to be on the ground floor for a couple reasons, so that individuals who see me in my wheelchair offering help can say, wow, so they're not just sitting home on a couch watching TV, they actually can serve and not just be served. So there was a lot about the visibility of that, but also collecting information and data that's already happening at the airport, experienced by people with disabilities and those traveling. So one of the things I implemented was, we should always be able to ask any passenger, is there anything that I need to know about me that you're comfortable sharing to help me serve you best?
Wow.
We don't have to assume that they're disabled. I have had that conversation with total strangers who might be traveling with 4 kids to a funeral, losing someone they love, not really functioning in their natural or normal mindset. And yes, I need your help because I'm so lost. I am in a fog and I don't know how I'm going to deal with what's on the other side of that plane ride. Will you help me? Because legally you can't ask, are you disabled? And 85% of all disabilities are invisible. So we're not crossing any line, but we're showing complete and total empathy to everyone. And so in that moment, we bring in the army and give you everything you need to get there. The airport is what, 5,500 acres?
I've been to the Atlanta airport several times. First of all, I love it. And yes, you're right. It's ginormous.
Huge. You
And
got to
you're
get on a
rolling
plane,
around.
train,
Yvette,
automobile.
you're rolling around that airport in that
Yes,
wheelchair?
yes. And even if you're just walking it, we need to make every accommodation available to every passenger all the time. There's
Be-
no such thing as an abuse of a system or an accommodation, because not all disabilities are permanent, right? They're situational, right? There's injury, accident, there's aging, and there's illness. There's temporary, permanent, and situational. COVID is the
Oh,
perfect example of a situational need for someone to use an accommodation. How popular were power doors, right, during
yes.
COVID? How popular was the form of communication we're using today remotely to work? It was one of the first times that my crazy looked normal. The very things we had been begging for decades, access to work remotely, power doors, curb cuts, accessible bathrooms, like all the things that were created to accommodate someone who could not, like participate in that activity without an accommodation, But the great thing about it is it's not exclusive, it's inclusive. So what we ask for is never just for or about us. It's for anyone, anytime, at any point in their lives, because our bodies change, our bodies get tired. I'm wearing glasses. I haven't always worn glasses. Our bodies have a need to be accommodated. And we need to be a country, a world, an organization, and a group of people to be willing to do that and prepared to do that. We're an incredible country.
Yes, we are. And you have an incredible family. Now I want to go to the book because this is a wonderful story of it's all in the family. It is a family affair. I could go on with song titles and TV titles, but it's true. Any type of disability, it doesn't just affect the person, it affects everybody around them. But if you allow yourself to fluidly go with the flow, you become an enhanced person. You all of a sudden grow beyond anything you could have ever imagined. And when you can get outside of yourself, when you can allow yourself to learn about somebody else and adjust the way you behave to accommodate somebody else, oh my God, the feeling is unbelievable. I, yeah, I mean, I know this because we have this in our family. Our family is no different than most other families. And I just naturally got along with my nephew, John, in the banner of this show. I've interviewed him a couple times already. John's going to be 40 next month. And so I watch how his siblings deal with him. I watched how his two parents dealt with him. Now they were divorced. So my sister was the day to day, but dad supplied the money. Dad wasn't going to be the best day to day because it's just not who he was, but he at least was there for the financial support. And then at a point in time when John was able to converse, when he was a little better communicating and building a relationship, because that took time, then dad was more on board. And you have to realize not everybody is where they need to be at this moment in time to accommodate a change in a family member,
Mhm.
right? Now, let's talk about those kids. So you did say that your older son came home with a note from the teacher and say what the note was about again?
Is
Say,
my mommy going to die? What should I tell him when he asks me that question?
whose idea was it to write the book, My Mommy Had Brain Surgery and I'm Okay?
It was their idea. They wanted to turn bullying into a book. So here I am, relatively newly disabled, right? Awakened, right, by his question, showing up with a body brace and a neck brace and a Walmart wheelchair, for lack of a better word, but a very big, cumbersome, heavy wheelchair, just so that I can start to participate in their lives differently. And the kids were brutal. What's wrong with your mom? Like, she has wheels, and my mommy has feet, and she's rolling around, and she just looks different. And they were like, we're good. Life is great. We made every attempt to include them. And in that moment, I felt like going from an engineer and applying the educator skill sets really helped me be a better parent. I mean, that's the whole reason I went back to school, to be an educator, because I felt like, again, as an engineer, if I put education on top of a problem, it would fix it. What I did learn, though, is the psyche of a child is developing every day. So they went to my doctor's appointments with me. They got to touch and see my stitches. They got to go to doctor's appointments and ask the doctors questions. So we intentionally included them at a very early age. We allowed them to experience the changes that was happening and to ask the questions. One question specifically during my recovery was, what can mommy do better? What would you like to see mommy do again? And they said, I don't know, mom. We really miss you making macaroni and cheese. So for the next 6 months, the goal of my recovery was the ability to make macaroni and cheese. We feel like all voices need to be heard, no matter how big or small. And so their little voices got bigger as we included them. And so they wanted to be able to share that with their friends. So in our effort to teach them that, we created a nonprofit called Dream Right Hope University. The way that that came about was storyboarding, vision boarding. First, there was a dream, then there was the hope. Then there was a right. I'm sorry, there was a dream, then there was a right, and then there was a hope. And that's how they wrote their book. We created a dream board, we put macaroni and cheese on it. Then they wrote about it. And then what was the hope for the future? And that's for mommy to make macaroni and cheese. I had no idea that this would be a model for curriculum to help 10,000 students and families and schools to tell their story and create, this legacy that started out as a trauma, And so that's how they ended up writing their book. And they went around, locally and spoke at libraries and visited other kids in hospitals and were able to encourage them through their book. And their books are in libraries across Georgia. And I will say, I'm so happy that I always have to bring more books because they don't get returned to the library. But they get to show up as kids with other kids who are experiencing brain injuries and trauma, and go to schools and accompany me as I talked about it. And again, that would not have come from an experience I had as an engineer, but as an educator, it helped me to help them. And so now these kids that were still bullying would say, "What's wrong with your mom?" And now they were empowered to say, "Buy the book. It's my college fund."
I love it by the book. Oh my God. Okay. What does bullying look like? You've said it a couple times. What did it look like?
Just the angry and hurtful words that were said about their mom, and something that separated them from the other kids, and harsh
Okay.
questions about what's wrong and your life must be horrible, why does your mother look like that, and things like that, just really
Okay.
harsh things that they said about a
Okay.
parent who they loved, and a home that they really didn't see a major difference in, because we included them, their voices mattered. And so it was a dichotomy, like, okay, my friends are asking me what's wrong, but I love my household. There were some things they had to do differently. And we talked through that, like vacuum cleaners, my worst enemy. And so I couldn't be around a vacuum cleaner. We had to tell them that. And the
Because
expectation of that,
the noise was too much for your head.
the noise, the
Yeah.
vibration, the
Oh,
pitch, the neurological sensitivities to it that we had to find out the hard way, and so they talk about that, how sometimes they had to play in different rooms or on a different floor because, mommy was not feeling well. And so to give them that information in an age appropriate way helped empower them and give them conversation to in language to use when people talked about how they were different, and so that's a lot of the bullying that was attempted, because it didn't really penetrate, because we empowered them at home and we told them how wonderful and great they were, and how difference didn't mean uh, that they were bad people or that they were in a bad home. And we gave them language. One really quick story I thought was adorable was when we started doing these talks, and local newspapers and news outlets were reaching out. Again, we backed into this whole thing. We had no idea it would become what it is today. And so we started to get into magazines and newspapers and on TV, and they were like, "Ooh, mommy, I think we're famous."
oh my God, this is so cute.
It is, because like they saw their pictures everywhere. And I said, wow, that's a really big word. Let's look it up and see what it looks like and
Famous.
what famous looks like." And so they put famous into the computer, and they saw people doing incredible things and having incredible access. And I was like, "Does that look like our household?" Like, "No, mommy, it doesn't." "Well, can I give you another word?" Right? Can we call ourselves servants? Can we call ourselves needing the media to share what we're doing with people we'll never meet, we'll never get to touch or see them personally, but they need to hear your story? Is that a better word? And they looked it up and they said, yeah, that looks more like our household because I'm not on yachts and, in a fancy car or a fancy house. Mommy cries and mommy hurts, and that just doesn't really feel famous to me. So when you speak with your friend, if you agree, can we give them a different vocabulary?
Involving the family
Yes.
is is such a wonderful, I mean, I'm at a loss for the word. It's it allows the family to pull upon skills, talents, ways of thinking that they don't even know they have.
Right.
The family gets to go deep internally, philosophically, and broaden their view of life and the world and human beings.
Right.
And when you involve the family, dare I say, could actually be enjoyable. I mean, what happened to you was not so fun when it was happening, and you still have your struggles, I'm sure, on a daily basis, maybe just physical pain, but just raising the family up to be bigger than they ever thought they could be. I mean, this is where I see the value in not necessarily having a special needs person, but if you're going to, man, this can change your life exponentially in the best way possible, can it not?
100%. We got to heal together. We got to grow through it instead of going through it. And their emotional intelligence, we didn't have the word for it at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But looking back, I could never have taught them the emotional intelligence that they have as human beings to care and truly love other people. It is an emotional IQ. So I tell people a lot that, my IQ dropped considerably, but my EQ in the process, my emotional quotient as opposed to my intellectual quotient
Yeah.
made me a whole human. You know how we talk about using 10% of our brain? I was
Yeah.
only using my left brain, my engineering brain, my logistics head, and then this happened, and so my EQ just blossomed. It was the other side of my brain. It was what I learned as an educator. It was what I was doing with and for my kids, what they do and did for me, and having this experience together, because whether I include them or not, everyone feels disability in the home. They feel the shift. They feel some of the inhumane behaviors outside of the home, some of the probing and mostly inappropriate questions. Like, they see the dignity that's being lost in question. They see when a total stranger pats me on the head and says, "Go you, you're out of the house and your hair is combed and look at you with lipstick on. Go you." And they get to see that, and so when I was told after, my injury that I would never regain my executive function, I had to deal with what that looked like. But I also understood that we could beat it like we beat everything else. And so, yeah, there's definitely loss in those areas. And like you mentioned, it didn't just happen once and it didn't just happen to me. We continue at every level of their growth and my recovery, learn new things. So, yes, I had a brain and a spinal cord injury. Now that I sit 90% of the time, there's other parts of my body that are breaking down. So it is something that doesn't happen once. It continues to happen every single time I leave the house, every single time I go to a doctor's appointment, every time it takes just a little bit longer for me to get out of bed.
Well, a couple things. I mean, for those people and that person who look at you, you go, no, I don't think people mean it
Of course not.
adversely, but I'm saying this to everybody who's done it and may do it in the future, don't, because because you don't understand the resilience and the capability of people if you just stand back and let them do what they're about to do,
I
and
love it.
then meet them where they are, you
I
know?
actually love it. I know it's crazy as it sounds. I think it's the educator in me. I love the invitation.
Oh, to teach
Have
when
an
somebody does
interaction.
something to, okay. All right.
I
Get
can
on that.
promise you in every instance, it's the last time they do that to anyone. But that only comes with
But
a
not
group
by
of people.
insulting them, by explaining.
Oh no, by interacting with them and loving them and
Okay.
answering the questions that if they had prior to the head pat, there would not be a head pat. But it's great to be able to say, yeah, I am out. It's so hard. But, I appreciate you recognizing that I'm in a place that I normally wouldn't be. What's your name? And then the conversation becomes a transaction that fills our bank, right? Makes a deposit instead of a withdrawal.
Okay. And then I wanted to make a comment on the EQ, emotional intelligence versus IQ, intellectual quotient.
Right.
IQ meaning the intelligence. So interestingly, emotional intelligence has been a big discussion, especially in the corporate America area. A lot of changes there. But as you were talking, I'm thinking, this is interesting. So her IQ was up here, her EQ was down here, but by virtue of this traumatic situation, your EQ came up, your IQ, you're probably both elevated to the point where you are functioning at a much better humanistic level. You still have the intelligence, or we wouldn't be having this conversation. And you probably could afford to lose a little if your IQ was so high. And I assume it was if you were getting into Harvard. But that EQ is so tough, man. We don't teach that in school. We only learn that by hard knocks and by other people talking about it. And if we could get those two things together, politicians, I don't even have to name a name. Politicians have zero EQ. They come from law, they come from industry, tech, they come from all these different backgrounds, but zero empathy. They don't honor the human being. The human beings are expendable because, oh, isn't this great? Robots can take our place. No, they can't.
Right.
No, then we have a sad, sad world. Okay, we could go on for several hours, but we have to end. I'm so sorry, Yvette. The book. It'll
And
be in the show notes. My mommy had brain surgery and I'm okay. By her two children, Isaiah and Elijah, and mom.
yeah, yes.
Yeah,
That
you
was
have
our first book and an opportunity for us to, again, share the experience. And they became public speakers, before the age of 10. And there's, a lot of pictures of them, pointing into the audience so that their peers can ask a question. They went from being bullied to being some of the most popular kids at school because they knew something, like you said, that wasn't being taught, that was different, and maybe questions they had that they could never answer because they may have had grandparents or family members with disabilities or in wheelchairs. We're afraid of what we don't know. And that book and others that, came afterwards helped to have the conversation or at least open the door to it.
to be more enriched people and a much better world to live in.
Yeah.
And I can't thank you enough for helping us do that. Thank you very, very much, Yvette, and thank you for participating in the show.
Thank you for having me. This has been amazing. And you're such an amazing interviewer. Like the questions that you're asking go so deep to our purpose and our presence in the world. And so I just want to thank you for being willing to ask the difficult questions because your audience is going to thank you and be better for it.
I appreciate that because the whole purpose of this show is to connect, just like you, to connect, to bring awareness. I mean, there are resources out there, but how do you aggregate them? How do you give them to people? Because everything is either county wide, if you're dealing with the government, or statewide, or you live in a community. I mean, where are you going to go? You have other obligations. You have to live in your house. So there's just so much, and I am honored to be part of this community, well, the community of life and the community of special needs. And the way I began the show is the way I'm ending the show, and that is, in the world of special needs, we all need each other.